Imagine an economy so advanced that a merchant in Britain could seamlessly trade with a supplier in Syria, using a single currency, across thousands of kilometers, without ever meeting face to face. An economy where ships the size of modern cargo vessels moved grain across continents, where street food fed entire cities, where bankers transferred wealth without moving a single coin. And yet, this same system, the most sophisticated of the ancient world, didn't collapse because of barbarians at the gates. It collapsed because of its own logic. This is the real story of how the Roman economy worked, not as a collection of markets, but as a fully integrated operating system, one that powered an empire of up to 80 million people and ultimately consumed itself. The Roman Empire functioned as the first truly integrated, multimodal economic operating system in human history, creating a blueprint for civilization that modern economies still mirror in their foundational logic. To understand how the Roman economy actually worked, one must move beyond the imagery of triumphant legions and marble temples to examine the invisible ledger of statecraft, logistics, and private enterprise that sustained an empire of 60 to 80 million people. This system was not a monolith, but an evolving mechanism that transitioned from a loose collection of conquered territories into a highly regimented, bureaucratic state that eventually consumed itself through rational but catastrophic crisis management. The Mediterranean as a logistical superhighway. The primary determinant of Roman economic success was the mastery of geography, specifically the Mediterranean Sea. The Romans transformed this body of water into Mare Nostrum, our sea, effectively a giant conveyor belt for commodities. The efficiency of water transport was the secret sauce of Roman prosperity. During this era, moving goods by sea was approximately 50 to 60 times cheaper than moving them by land. This cost differential dictated the entire structural development of the empire. Inland regions, unless connected by navigable rivers, remained largely subsistence-based, while coastal cities flourished as hubs of globalized trade. The physical manifestation of this maritime power was found in the massive infrastructure projects at ports like Ostia and Portus. These were not merely docks, but sophisticated logistics centers featuring lighthouses, deep-water basins, and enormous warehouses known as Horrea, ships carrying up to 1,000 tons of cargo, unmatched until the modern era, regularly made the journey from Alexandria to Rome, bringing the grain that prevented urban starvation. This logistical prowess allowed for an unprecedented level of regional specialization. Spain became the empire's olive oil factory, Egypt its breadbasket, and Gaul its vineyard. The currency engine, trust, debasement, and the psychology of money. If the Mediterranean was the highway, coinage was the bloodstream. The Roman monetary system achieved something revolutionary: a single, trusted currency that allowed a merchant in Britain to trade with a supplier in Syria without the friction of exchange rates or bartering. For centuries, the silver denarius was the global gold standard, its value anchored in its precious metal content. However, this was a commodity-based system, meaning the state's fiscal capacity was limited by its access to silver and gold mines. When the costs of maintaining the military and the bureaucracy began to outpace tax revenues, the emperors turned to debasement, the practice of reducing the silver purity of coins while maintaining their face value. This was a rational response to short-term liquidity crises, such as paying a donative to a new emperor's soldiers or funding a defensive war. Yet, the long-term consequence was a catastrophic erosion of trust. As the silver content of the denarius dropped from nearly 100% under Augustus to less than 5% during the crisis of the 3rd century, the psychological foundation of the economy collapsed. This debasement was not just a technical failure, it was a fundamental breakdown of information. Merchants, realizing the coins were worth less than their face value, raised prices, leading to hyperinflation. By the time of Diocletian, the state could no longer even pay its own employees in coin, shifting instead to a system of taxes and salaries paid in kind: grain, meat, clothing. This demonetization forced the empire to revert to a more primitive, less efficient economic state, which in turn weakened the central government's ability to respond to external threats. The urban retail world, Tabernae, and the 8-day rhythm. For the average urban resident, the Roman economy was experienced through the taberna, the versatile one-room shop that lined the streets of every city. The taberna was the atom of Roman retail, serving as a shop, a factory, and a home. Unlike modern retail, which separates production from consumption, a Roman shoemaker or baker would produce their goods in the back of the taberna and sell them across the counter at the front. The rhythm of these shops was governed by the Nundinae, an 8-day market cycle that long predated the 7-day week. Every 8th day, the agricultural population would flock to the nearest city or crossroads market to sell their surplus and purchase essentials like salt or iron tools. These market days were the primary nodes of exchange for the rural population, ensuring that even isolated farmers were integrated into the wider imperial network. Urban retail was a practical necessity. Most city dwellers lived in crowded apartment blocks, insulae, that were fire hazards and lacked cooking facilities. This created a massive market for Thermopolia, snack bars, where the urban poor could buy cheap, hot meals. These establishments were more than just businesses. They were the social hubs of the city, where news was exchanged and neighborhood politics were debated. The density of these shops in cities like Ostia and Pompeii demonstrates a high level of monetization at the street level. Even the poorest citizens were active participants in a cash-based economy for their daily survival. The imperial welfare state, Cura Annonae, and the political bargain. The most complex and expensive logistical undertaking of the Roman state was the Cura Annonae, the grain dole. By the 2nd century AD, the city of Rome had a population of roughly 1 million people, requiring an estimated 200,000 to 400,000 tons of grain annually. Because the Italian hinterland could not support such a population, the state created a sprawling procurement system that reached into Egypt and North Africa. The Annona was not merely a humanitarian effort, it was a foundational piece of imperial statecraft. Emperors understood that a hungry capital city was a rebellious one. By providing free or subsidized grain to about 200,000 adult male citizens, the emperor ensured the obedience of the urban populace, the famous bread and circuses. To manage this, the state did not build its own merchant fleet, but instead used a public-private partnership model, offering legal privileges and tax exemptions to private ship owners who dedicated their vessels to the grain trade. The logistical requirements of the Annona had a profound multiplier effect on the wider economy. The demand for grain stimulated the development of massive estates, latifundia, in the provinces and encouraged the growth of secondary industries like pottery, for amphorae, timber for ships, and banking for maritime loans. The Annona essentially provided a state-subsidized backbone for the entire Mediterranean trade network, lowering the costs for private merchants to move other goods alongside the government's grain. Private banking and the fragility of credit. One of the most modern aspects of the Roman economy was its banking system, yet it operated without any of the institutional safeguards we take for granted today. Roman banking was a purely private affair based on the reputation, fides, of individual bankers known as argentari. These bankers, usually from the plebeian or freedman classes, operated out of small stalls in the forum, providing services that would be familiar to a 21st century investor. Deposit accounts, interest-bearing loans, and credit transfers. The system allowed for the transfer of massive sums across the empire without the physical movement of coins. A merchant could deposit silver in Ephesus and receive a credit note to be cashed in Rome, a mechanism that reduced the risk of piracy and banditry. Interest rates were generally stable at around 1% per month, but because there was no central bank or lender of last resort, the system was incredibly fragile. The Roman elite, particularly the senatorial class, maintained a deeply ingrained cultural prejudice against direct participation in banking or trade, viewing it as ignoble. However, they were the empire's primary source of capital. They bypassed this social taboo by using their most capable slaves and freedmen as agents or principals to manage their investments. This created a principal-agent economy, where the real financiers were the aristocracy, but the face of the business was the merchant class. This separation of capital from management allowed the elite to maintain their status while reaping the rewards of a sophisticated commercial economy. Taxation, from corrupt outsource to the imperial deep state. The evolution of Roman taxation reflects the empire's transition from a loose republic into a centralized autocratic state. During the Republic, Rome had virtually no civil service. It collected taxes by farming them out to private corporations known as publicani. These tax farmers would pay the state a lump sum up front for the right to collect taxes in a province, keeping anything extra they could extort as profit. This system was efficient for the treasury, but devastating for the provinces, leading to systemic corruption and unrest. Augustus recognized that this model was unsustainable and replaced it with a professional, census-based administration. By conducting regular surveys of the empire's land and population, the state was able to regularize the tax burden. This shift created two distinct treasuries: the aerarium, the old senatorial treasury, and the fiscus, the emperor's personal and administrative treasury. This centralization allowed for more predictable revenue, which was essential for funding the professional standing army. However, as the empire's borders stopped expanding in the 2nd century, the state could no longer rely on the spoils of war to fund its operations. The rising costs of the deep state, the army, and the growing bureaucracy forced the emperors to repeatedly increase the tax burden on the existing population. This taxation was regressive, falling most heavily on small farmers and the mercantile middle class, while the wealthy aristocracy used their political influence to secure exemptions. By the late Empire, this led to a tax revolt of sorts, where small farmers abandoned their land because the cost of paying the tax exceeded the value of the crop. The military-industrial complex, equipping the legions. The Roman military was the single largest economic entity in the classical world, absorbing roughly 70% to 80% of the entire state budget. To keep 300,000 to 450,000 professional soldiers equipped, the empire developed a sophisticated supply chain that transitioned from private contracts to state-run nationalization. In the early empire, soldiers were often responsible for buying their own gear from private dealers, gladiari, who followed the camps. After the crisis of the 3rd century, the private sector could no longer keep pace with the army's demands due to the collapse of the currency and the disruption of trade. In response, the Emperor Diocletian established the Fabricae, a network of state-run arms factories located in strategic cities near the frontiers. These factories represented a massive shift toward a command economy. Thousands of workers, whose positions eventually became hereditary, mass-produced standardized equipment like the famous ridge helmet and chainmail. The presence of the military fundamentally transformed the economy of frontier regions like Britain and the Rhine. The Vindolanda tablets, discovered at a fort in northern England, provide a vivid look at this frontier economy. The tablets record military pay, requests for leave, and the purchase of everyday goods like beer, socks, and even birthday invitations. The army injected hard money into these remote areas, encouraging local tribes to adopt Roman agriculture and trade to earn the coins needed to pay their own taxes. In this way, the military was not just a defensive force, but the primary engine of Romanization and economic monetization in the provinces. The labor paradox, from slavery to the Colonate. The Roman economy was built on the back of coerced labor, but the nature of that coercion changed fundamentally over time. During the period of expansion, the latifundia, large estates, of Italy were worked by massive gangs of slaves captured in war. This industrial slavery allowed the Roman elite to produce agricultural surpluses at a very low cost, which in turn funded their political careers and luxury lifestyles. However, when the empire stopped expanding, the supply of cheap slaves dried up. At the same time, a series of plagues and civil wars reduced the free population, creating a labor shortage. To ensure that the land remained cultivated and the tax revenue continued to flow, the state created the Colonate, a legal system that bound free tenant farmers, colony, to the soil. The Colonate represented the birth of Proto-Feudalism. While colony were technically free, they were prohibited by law from leaving their estates. This ensured the state's tax base remained fixed, but destroyed the flexible labor market that had characterized the early empire. Over time, these tenant farmers became increasingly dependent on local landowners for protection as the central government's power waned, setting the stage for the manorial system of the Middle Ages. The information state, why the clerks outlasted the emperors. A final, often overlooked mechanism of the Roman economy was the administrative deep state. During the crisis of the 3rd century, 26 emperors rose and fell in just 50 years, yet the empire did not collapse into total anarchy. This was because the underlying administrative system, the tax collectors, the record keepers, and the legal clerks, remained in place. These men controlled information, which in a pre-modern world was a form of power more enduring than armies. This bureaucracy became the operating system of the empire. While emperors were fighting civil wars or being assassinated, the clerks in the provincial capitals continued to update the census, collect the grain taxes, and maintain the roads. However, this bureaucracy eventually became a burden of its own. To manage the crumbling economy, Diocletian and his successors doubled the size of the civil service and implemented strict price controls. These measures were intended to save the empire, but they also stifled the private initiative that had built it. The emergency powers of the late 3rd century never ended. They became the permanent operating system, slowly hollowing out the empire from within through rational but suffocating overmanagement. Synthesis. The legacy of a rational catastrophe. The Roman economic system did not fall in a single moment of barbarian invasion. Instead, it was a complex machine that eventually consumed itself through its own defensive reactions. For 5 centuries, it maintained an unprecedented level of prosperity by leveraging the Mediterranean for cheap transport, creating a trusted global currency, and building a sophisticated private credit market. The system's ultimate failure was a result of its own rigidity. When faced with the pressures of the 3rd and 4th centuries, the state responded by nationalizing industry, binding labor to the soil, and debasing the currency. These actions were entirely rational in the short term. They kept the army paid and the cities fed, but they destroyed the foundations of the classical economy. The flexible, market-oriented world of the early empire was replaced by a regimented, extractive state that resembled the feudal world it would eventually become. The Roman economy actually worked because it was the first system to successfully integrate the entire Mediterranean basin into a single market. Its collapse serves as a perennial case study in the dangers of fiscal manipulation and the unintended consequences of centralized control. While the empire eventually dissolved, its logistical DNA, its roads, its legal principles, and its urban blueprints remains the foundation of the modern Western world. The Roman operating system did not simply vanish, it was the scaffold upon which every subsequent European economy was built. If you like content like this, and you share interest about history and historical topics, join us on this channel. We have a lot of interesting topics in preparation for you. Let's explore history together.